There is a strange moment in some people's lives when they suddenly stop explaining themselves. They stop defending every decision. They stop correcting every misunderstanding. They stop trying to prove that their intentions were good. And strangely enough, this is often the moment when other people start paying closer attention. But why? Why would someone who once felt the need to explain everything suddenly become comfortable with being misunderstood? And more importantly, what happened inside their mind? Imagine this. You send someone a message. They misunderstand what you meant. A few years ago, you might have immediately written a long explanation. You misunderstood me. What I meant was, then another message, and another. You carefully choose every word because you desperately want them to see your side. But this time, you don't. You read the message, you pause, and you simply think they can believe whatever they want. That tiny change may look like indifference, but psychologically, something much deeper can be happening. Because people usually don't stop explaining themselves because they suddenly stop caring. Sometimes they stop because they finally realize that being understood by everyone is impossible, and that realization can completely change the way a person behaves. Think about how exhausting it is to constantly manage other people's opinions of you. You say something, someone interprets it differently. You explain, they misunderstand the explanation, so you explain that explanation. Eventually, you're no longer living your life. You're managing a courtroom inside everyone else's mind, and you're constantly trying to prove that you're innocent. Is that the more you explain, the more explanations people can argue with. Every additional detail creates another opportunity for someone to disagree, and this creates a psychological trap. You think you're gaining control by explaining more, but sometimes you're actually giving away more control because you're allowing another person's interpretation to determine how peaceful you feel. If they understand you, you feel okay. If they don't, you feel anxious. If they approve, you feel accepted. If they criticize you, you feel the need to defend yourself. Your emotional state becomes dependent on their conclusion, and that is where the shift begins. People who stop over-explaining often discover something uncomfortable. You cannot control what another person thinks about you. You can control what you say. You can control your intentions. You can control your actions. But you cannot control the story someone creates about you. And once someone truly accepts that, they become much harder to manipulate with misunderstanding. Because misunderstanding only has power when you feel responsible for correcting it. Consider a simple example. You decide to leave a social group because it no longer feels healthy for you. Someone asks, "Why are you leaving?" The old version of you might give them 10 reasons. You explain the history. You explain every conversation. You explain who said what. You explain that you're not angry. You explain that you don't hate anyone. You explain that you simply need something different. And after all of that, someone may still say, "So basically you think you're better than us." Now you're back at the beginning. So you explain again, but imagine a different response. "I've decided this is what is right for me. That's it." No courtroom, no 20-minute defense, no desperate attempt to control their interpretation. This doesn't mean you're arrogant. It means you've accepted that your decision doesn't require unanimous approval. And this is one of the biggest psychological differences between insecurity and inner stability. Insecurity asks, "How can I make everyone understand me?" Stability asks, "Do I understand myself?" That is a completely different question, and once someone begins asking it, their behavior can change dramatically. They become quieter, not because they have nothing to say, but because they no longer feel obligated to say everything. They listen more. They react less, they choose their battles, and they begin to understand something most people learn much later in life. Not every misunderstanding deserves a correction. But there's another reason people suddenly stop explaining themselves. Sometimes they have explained themselves too many times to people who were never actually listening. This is where the story becomes more painful. Imagine repeatedly telling someone, "That hurt me." You explain what happened. You explain why it mattered. You explain what you needed instead. They apologize, then they do the same thing again. So you explain again and again and again. Eventually, something changes. Not necessarily in the other person, inside you. You realize that the problem wasn't that they didn't understand your words. They understood. They simply didn't change their behavior. And that realization can be incredibly powerful. Because there is a huge difference between being misunderstood and being ignored. If someone genuinely doesn't understand you, explanation can help. But if someone understands you and repeatedly chooses to disregard your boundaries, more explanation usually won't solve the problem. At some point, Behavior becomes the conversation. You don't need another speech. You need a decision. And this is why some people appear to suddenly become quiet. From the outside, it looks sudden. Inside, it may have been building for months or even years. Every unanswered explanation, every repeated disappointment, every time they were told they were too sensitive, every moment they had to prove that their feelings were legitimate, until eventually they become tired of auditioning for understanding. And when that happens, silence can feel more peaceful than another explanation. But there is an even deeper psychological shift. People who stop explaining themselves often stop confusing being understood with being valued. Those two things are not the same. Someone can understand exactly why you made a decision and still dislike it. Someone can understand your boundary and still disagree with it. Someone can understand your feelings and still choose not to accommodate them. Understanding does not automatically create agreement, and agreement does not automatically create respect. Once you understand this, you stop trying to win every conversation. You start asking a better question. Is this person actually capable of meeting me where I am? That's a much more useful question, because sometimes the goal isn't to convince someone. The goal is to find out whether convincing them is even necessary. And this creates another interesting effect. When you stop explaining everything, people may become curious. They may ask, "What's wrong? Why are you so quiet? Why didn't you defend yourself? Why don't you care anymore?" And here's the paradox. Sometimes people become more interested in your thoughts after you stop giving them unlimited access to those thoughts. Not because silence is some magical power move, but because constant explanation removes mystery. When you explain every emotion, every decision, every intention, there is nothing left for another person to wonder about. But when you become comfortable saying less, people have to sit with uncertainty. And humans generally dislike uncertainty. Our brains naturally try to fill gaps. If you don't explain why you left, they may create their own explanation. If you don't explain why you changed, they may start wondering what happened. If you don't defend yourself against every accusation, they may start questioning whether their assumption was even correct. This is why silence can sometimes feel powerful. But here's where we need to be careful. Not explaining yourself is not the same as refusing to communicate. There is a healthy version of this and an unhealthy version. The unhealthy version says, "I won't tell anyone anything because everyone is against me." That's not strength. That's emotional isolation. The healthy version says, "I will communicate when communication can actually improve the situation. I just don't need to defend my existence to everyone." That's maturity. You don't disappear from every difficult conversation. You simply stop participating in pointless ones. And this distinction matters because sometimes people use "I don't need to explain myself" as an excuse to avoid accountability. If you hurt someone, an explanation may be necessary. If you made a mistake, an apology may be necessary. If someone genuinely deserves clarity, giving them clarity can be an act of respect. The goal isn't to become unreachable. The goal is to become intentional. To know when your words can build something and when your words are simply feeding an argument that has no finish line. Think about the last time you felt misunderstood. Maybe someone judged your decision. Maybe a friend interpreted your silence as anger. Maybe someone assumed you were lazy, selfish, arrogant, distant, or uncaring. What did you do? Did you immediately rush to correct their opinion? If you did, ask yourself why. Was the misunderstanding actually damaging your life? Or did it simply make you uncomfortable that someone had the wrong picture of you? That distinction is incredibly important because sometimes we aren't trying to solve a problem. We're trying to remove the discomfort of being misunderstood, and those are two very different things. The desire to be understood is deeply human. We all want someone to say, "I see you. I understand why you did that. I know who you really are." But if you make that validation a requirement for inner peace, you hand other people an enormous amount of power. One person can misunderstand you, another can criticize you, another can dislike you, and another can completely misjudge your intentions. If your identity depends on correcting all of them, you will spend your life explaining. But if you know yourself deeply enough, you can let some misunderstandings pass. Not because they don't matter, because they don't define you. And this may be the most powerful reason people stop explaining themselves. They begin building an identity that doesn't require an audience. They stop asking, do they think I'm successful? And start asking, am I proud of what I'm building? They stop asking, do they think I'm a good person? And start asking, am I acting according to my values? They stop asking, do they understand my decision? And start asking, was this decision right for me? Notice the difference. The center of gravity moves from outside to inside. And when that happens, your behavior naturally becomes quieter. You don't announce every goal. You don't defend every choice. You don't reveal every plan. You don't need to win every disagreement. You simply live. And people may misunderstand you. Let them. They may criticize you. Let them. They may create a version of you that exists entirely inside their imagination. Let them. Because eventually, you discover something strangely liberating. You can spend your entire life correcting people's opinions and still never control them. You can spend that same energy becoming someone you respect. And there is one final psychological shift that makes this transformation complete. You stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided what they want to believe, because persuasion only works when the other person is open to changing their mind. If someone asks a genuine question, answer it. If someone wants to understand, explain. But if someone is collecting your words only to use them against you, more words won't create understanding. They'll create more material for the argument. And that's when silence becomes a choice rather than a reaction. Not angry silence, not manipulative silence, not the silent treatment, just peaceful silence. The kind that says, I know who I am, and I don't need to convince you every 5 minutes. And perhaps that's what people are really noticing when someone suddenly stops explaining themselves. They aren't becoming colder. They may simply be becoming more selective with their energy. They aren't necessarily losing empathy. They may finally be learning boundaries. They aren't necessarily becoming arrogant. They may be becoming comfortable with uncertainty. And they aren't necessarily giving up on people. Sometimes they're simply giving up on the exhausting idea that everyone must understand them. So the next time someone misunderstands you, pause before you rush to explain. Ask yourself one question. Does this person genuinely need clarity, or do I simply need their approval? Because the answer can change everything. You don't have to explain every chapter of your life to every person who reads one page. You don't have to convince everyone that your intentions were good, and you don't have to chase understanding from people who have already chosen their conclusion. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is enough, and sometimes the person you were desperately trying to explain yourself to was never the person you needed to convince. It was you. Because the moment you finally understand yourself, you become much less afraid of being misunderstood.